Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to thank 1871 for hosting us here today and all of you for being a part of this. So I want to begin by pointing out the fact that it's been 15 and a half years since the 21st century ended, the American century. And it was a century in which our nation overcame depression, led the world against evil multiple times, and recorded some of the greatest advancements in human history. Airplanes in the sky, boot prints on the moon, the world's knowledge first brought online. And all of this was possible because we built what no civilization had ever built before: a vibrant, stable, broad, and accessible middle class through which our people drove the affairs of the world. So my parents were two immigrants from Cuba with little formal education. They reached the middle class in that century. They did so through humble jobs. First, as an assembly plant for lawn chairs, and then my mother went to work as a cashier, a maid, and finally a stock clerk at Kmart. My father was primarily a bartender for hotel banquets. They never got rich, but my parents achieved the American dream because through these modest jobs, they reached financial security, they raised a family in a safe neighborhood, they provided for our needs, and they left their children with lives even better than their own. More people achieved this American dream in America in the 20th century than at any other time and in any other place in human history. But today, many jobs like the ones my parents held no longer provide a viable path to the middle class. Their jobs, assembling lawn chairs, or even the cashier job my mother held, have likely been replaced by machines. Other similar positions have been outsourced or have paid the same wage for a decade or more. Most of those impacted lack the qualifications to move into a better paying position, and the higher education they need is too expensive and requires too much time away from work and family. The result is that the path to the middle class is narrower today than it has been for generations, and the American dream so many achieved in the last century is now in peril. This hardship, it is not the result of a cyclical economic downturn that will naturally correct itself. It is born of a fundamental transformation to the very nature of our economy, the disruptions of which have been prolonged and compounded by the failure of our leaders, our policies, and our institutions to transform accordingly. There are two primary forces behind this transformation. The first is radical technological progress, including the development of the internet, information technologies, wireless and mobile capabilities, robotics, and more. And the second has risen partly from the first, and that is globalization. From where you sit, you can sell a product to someone on the other side of the world almost as easily as to the person on your left or your right. This has pulled us into competition with dozens of other nations for business, jobs, talent, and innovation. Over the last 2 decades, not a single industry has been untouched by these forces, and the disruptions have triggered a cascade of anxiety. Fewer Americans believe in the viability of the American dream today than during the worst of the financial crisis in 2009. Many pundits and media outlets stoke those fears, painting a dreary picture of the future in which automation and outsourcing continue to shatter the American workforce. But history is not silent on this subject. It's just the future is swayed by the actions we take, not by the predictions we make. Generations of Americans before us faced equally disruptive periods of transformation. For example, in the Industrial Revolution, machines suddenly automated tasks people had built their lives around for centuries. Like today, the beginning was rough. Jobs were lost, wages were static, and new wealth was concentrated at the top. Doubts and fears about the future were widespread. But then something changed. When our children learn about the Industrial Revolution today, they learn that it was a period of progress. Yes, jobs were lost, but even more were gained. And the middle class expanded, thrived, and laid the cornerstone of the American century. So how did that generation overcome the challenges? It wasn't through resistance, pushing back against new technologies or trying to resurrect old jobs. It was through adaptation. Business integrating new technologies, workers learning new skills, and leaders leading in a new direction. Today's technological revolution carries extraordinary opportunities, even more, I believe, than the Industrial Revolution ever did. But we have not yet seized these opportunities, nor is it guaranteed that we will. Whether we do or do not will depend on the actions we take, the leaders we choose, and the reforms we adopt. For the first 15 and a half years of this century, excuse me, for the first 15 and a half years of this century, Washington has looked to the past. Our economy has changed, but our economic policies have not. And we have learned painfully that the old ways no longer work. Washington cannot pretend that the world is the same as it was in the 1980s. It cannot raise taxes like it did in the 90s. And it cannot grow government like it did in the 2000s. The race for the future will never be won by going backward. It will never be won by hopping on Hillary Clinton's time machine to yesterday. She seems to believe, as many do, that pumping more of today's money into yesterday's programs will bring prosperity tomorrow. It will not. Nor will thinking small. Hiking the minimum wage by a few dollars will not save the American dream, but it will accelerate automation and outsourcing. Increasing taxes and regulations will not promote fairness or opportunity or help balance our budget, but it will snuff out innovation and crush small business. We need in this country a new president for a new age, with original ideas to unlock the two great doors to the future, the doors of innovation and the door of education. Only through an innovative economy can we translate new technologies into new middle-class jobs. And only through a revolutionized higher education system can we equip all of our people to fill these new and better-paying jobs. Prosperity in our time is likely if we act to embrace the future. We have opportunities that have never existed before and a chance to seize them that will never exist again. I come before you today to discuss my ideas, to spur American innovation onward, to ensure that the rise of the machines will not be the fall of the worker, and to create a new American century, propelled by a revitalized American dream and captured by a vibrant middle class. We know this much for certain. In the decades ahead, innovation will transform the world. Cars may soon drive themselves, which is good news for me if you've read some of the newspaper articles. Who are they going to give the red light camera to? Virtual reality, nanotechnology, robotics, and more will impact us in ways we can't yet imagine. Our devices will grow more powerful, bring new capabilities to the masses. The question is not whether innovations are coming. The question is whether America will develop and produce them, or whether our people will share in the wealth that they will help create. To build the most innovation-friendly economy in the world, we must build the most business-friendly economy in the world. Right now, we have quite nearly the exact opposite. The United States has the highest corporate tax rate in the developed world. We have a tax code that punishes American companies for competing in the global economy, and we have a regulatory system that prevents small businesses, who are the primary engines of innovation and job creation, from competing against established players. The result of this approach are in. For the first time in 35 years, we have more businesses dying than being born. In the first quarter of this year, our economy shrank for the third time since our recovery began. And over the last decade, the United States has lost $179 billion worth of domestic companies through foreign takeovers. But when I'm president, I will empower innovators rather than punish them. I will cut our corporate tax rate to be competitive with the average of 25% for developed nations. If we had done this 10 years ago, instead of losing $179 billion worth of American businesses, we would have acquired $590 billion worth of foreign firms. I will also establish a territorial tax system. Today, when an American company earns money overseas, it is taxed in that country, in the country that they earned it in, and then again, if it's brought back to America. We are the only G8 country that levies that second tax. And the understandable impact is that many companies choose never to bring their money back home. Apple, for example, has $171 billion sitting overseas. That money would be an immediate economic boost. But because Apple would be punished for bringing it back, they choose not to. My tax plan will allow immediate 100% expensing for businesses. This means that the more a company invests in creating jobs, the less they owe in taxes. And the more they pay their workers, the less they pay the government. I will put a ceiling on the amount of U.S. regulations and what they can cost our economy. Just since the year 2008, federal regulations have cost us $771 billion. Many of these regulations are the result of an alliance between big business and big government. Hillary Clinton has argued that the economy is rigged in favor of wealthy interests. And she's right. But what she won't tell you is that big government is doing the rigging. And a massive regulatory apparatus inevitably becomes the instrument of those with lawyers and lobbyists necessary to influence it. Government should work to empower and to protect the private sector, not to control it. Just 2 months ago, I sponsored and proposed a bipartisan plan with Senator Chris Coons to modernize our national lab system, which has long been a leading source of research in science, medicine, energy, and technology. Currently, much of this research gets trapped in the public sector, but my legislation would increase the lab's flexibility to partner with the private industry. We must also recognize the industries that need some special protection in the 21st century. In its short life, the internet has become one of humanity's greatest treasures, which is why it belongs in the hands of our people, not our government. In the Senate, I have fought to safeguard and reinforce internet freedom and digital opportunity, and will continue that fight as president. I led a coalition opposing efforts to cede internet regulatory power to the International Telecommunications Union. I will also advance a comprehensive wireless plan to expand unlicensed spectrum, spectrum is the highway of the digital age. But the amount made available to the public is limited, and the result is a digital traffic jam. As president, I will reallocate spectrum for public use, which could create an estimated 350,000 jobs per 500 megahertz. Finally, to win the global competition for innovation, we must win the global competition for talent. This requires reforming our legal immigration system to make it skill and merit-based rather than simply family-based, which will protect American workers and also attract more talent to grow our economy and to create jobs. Innovation is the first door to the future, but even once we pass through it, a second door remains shut in front of us. Innovation will create millionaires and even billionaires, but we must ensure it also creates a vibrant middle class. And that can only be done through the modernization of our higher education system. As our technological capabilities grow, it is true that we will see more low-paying jobs replaced by machines, but that's only part of the story. With the innovation economy I have just discussed, we will also see the creation of higher-paying, higher-skilled jobs that only humans can perform. And history backs this up. For example, when the power loom was invented, many feared it would eliminate all textile jobs. The truth turned out to be the opposite. The loom increased production, and as production increased, so did demand. And as demand increased, so did the need for skilled laborers who could operate the machines and manage the factories. Jobs in the textile industry actually increased for 100 years thereafter. But these jobs did not immediately pay higher wages. Before that could happen, workers needed to learn marketable skills that could be standardized across the industry. Only then could the methods learned in one factory become useful in another, which increased the need for experienced labor and gave workers leverage to demand higher wages. The lesson of history then is clear. To empower today's workers, we must equip them with today's skills. And to do that, we need a higher education system to innovate at the same rate as our economy. In the next 10 years, 3.5 million manufacturing jobs will be created. But if our higher education system remains stagnant and stuck in the past, 2 million of these jobs will be left unfilled. The same skills gap is felt across industries. Nearly 1 out of every 3 American employer reports having difficulty finding skilled applicants. Yet we still tell our students that to get a degree, they have to spend 4 years on a campus, tens of thousands of dollars on tuition and books and room and board, and hundreds of hours in a classroom, often learning subjects that aren't relevant to the modern economy. The result is that today many young people are graduating with a mountain of debt for degrees that will not lead to jobs, and many who need higher education the most, such as single parents and working adults, are left with few options that fit their schedules and their budgets. The problems with higher education are many, but the ideas from Hillary Clinton and other outdated leaders are narrow and short-sighted. We do not need timid tweaks to the old system. We need a holistic overhaul. We need to change how we provide degrees, how those degrees are accessed, how much the access costs, and how those costs are paid, and even how those payments are determined. As president, I will begin with a powerful but simple reform. Our higher education system today is controlled by what amounts to a cartel of existing colleges and universities, which use their power over the accreditation process to block innovative, low-cost competitors from entering the marketplace. Within my first 100 days, we will bust this cartel by establishing a new accreditation process that welcomes low-cost, innovative providers. This would expose higher education to market forces of choice and competition, which would prompt a revolution driven by the needs of students, just as the needs of consumers drive the prospect of other industries in our economy. Other reforms can hasten this transition. I will empower students to choose the right degree at the right price from the right institution for them. I've proposed an idea called the student right to know before you go act, which requires an institution to tell students how much they can expect to earn with a given degree before they take out the loans to pay for it. I will make student loans more manageable by making income-based repayment automatic for all graduates. So the more they make, the faster they pay back their loans. And the less they make, the less strain these loans will cause. I will reduce the risk associated with loans and ease the shadow of debt hovering over millions of graduates. But for future students, we can also create an alternative to loans that avoids the problem of debt altogether. I proposed an idea called the Student Investment Plan, which would let students partner with investors who would pay their tuition in return for a percentage of their earnings for a few years after graduation. It may result in a profit for the investor, or it may not. But unlike with loans, none of the risk lies with the student. As president, I will also make career and vocational education more widespread and accessible. This can begin as early as high school, so we can graduate students not just with a high school diploma, but also with a certification to work as a mechanic, a plumber, a welder, an electrician, or any number of good-paying occupations. And I will expand apprenticeship programs, which can provide on-the-job training and help standardize skills by allowing students to learn methods from experienced workers and then spread them throughout the industry. This is not an exhaustive list of ideas, but I have seen how these can begin to open doors for our middle class. In Miami, I have seen high schoolers graduate, certified to begin high-paying careers as BMW technicians. I have known single mothers whose hard-earned degrees have translated into long-sought financial security for themselves and for their children. And I have seen higher education shape my own life, both in terms of the enormous costs we must remedy and the enormous payoff we must extend to all. My innovation and higher education agendas form only a segment of the policy blueprint I have drawn up for my presidency. But the whole vision is based on a simple concept. New opportunities cannot be seized by old ideas, and the future must be embraced with enthusiasm and with vision. In the 19th century, a generation of Americans did exactly that. They faced challenges similar to ours. The steam engine made the world smaller. The telegraph opened a new age of communication. New machines created new industries and upended a centuries-old economic status quo. And just imagine what the world would have looked like if that generation had resisted these changes rather than embraced them. Imagine if they had refused to give up the old ways and allowed the promise of the industrial age to pass them by. The loss would have been suffered not only by their generation, but every generation after. And the American century, it would have never existed. The stakes for our time are just as high. If we fail to capture the promise of this new age, we will be the first generation to leave a weaker America behind. But if we succeed, we will lay the cornerstone for a new American century. We will not just recover economic ground, we will gain it. We will see the creation of higher paying, more fulfilling, more exciting jobs than ever before. There are those today, and there have always been, who say prosperity is impossible, that the future is lost. It seemed for a while that all you had to do to become a best-selling author is write a book predicting a post-American world, one driven by China or Europe or some other power. Many of these forecasts come from people who rarely leave Washington, D.C. If that city is all they see, it's no wonder they think America's in trouble. So I say to them, go to Boston. Walk through Kendall Square, often crowned as the most innovative square in the world. There they can peer through the looking glass into a remarkable, revolutionary future for our nation and the world. I say to them, go to Florida's Space Coast. See how an era of private and public partnership has put new adventures, new achievements, new discoveries within reach of humankind, and how suddenly an American flag on Mars has turned from an impossible pipe dream to an achievable American dream. I say to them, go to Reno, Nevada. See the data center being built by Apple. See the 1.2 million square foot distribution warehouse opened by Amazon. See the $5 billion gigafactory being constructed by Tesla and Panasonic, which will transform the automobile in this new century and create as many as 9,000 good-paying jobs in Nevada alone. I say to them, go to New Hampshire. Visit Southern New Hampshire University, which is consistently named one of the most innovative organizations in the world, on a list with Apple and Google, for how it pushes against the odds and against the naysayers to bring higher education into the 21st century. And I also say to them, come to Chicago. Visit 1871, this 50,000 square foot facility that serves as an incubator for digital innovation in the Midwest, providing entrepreneurs with mentorship, training, programming, and educational resources, potential investors, and a community of fellow dreamers dedicated to pulling the American businesses into a new age. These examples are not outliers. They are a pattern. Anyone who sees these things will understand that nothing has changed about our people. We are the inheritors of the American spirit, of the American dream, of the American century. In our veins flow the blood of men and women who refuse to accept the burdens of the past or to resign to the old way of doing things. Just as we pay respect to the Americans of the Industrial Revolution, so will the verdict of our time be written by those who have not yet been born. Let them write that we did our part, that in the early years of this century, we turned the corner on the past. We elected new leaders for a new time. We adopted policies that encouraged Americans to invent the products of tomorrow, manufacture them, and then sell them throughout the world. And we designed the higher education system that allowed our middle class to perform the great work and reap the great rewards of this century. Time has brought us to this doorstep of the future, but whether we turn the knob and push, whether we step across the threshold of a new age, whether we embrace this century with its challenges and its opportunities, its adventures and its dangers, it is a decision that is ours alone to make. I say we have lingered long enough on the future's edge, and I invite you to step forward with me, together. Thank you. Thank you.
Before we get started, don't sit down just yet.
Oh, okay.
Now, I know you love your Miami Dolphins, and we love our Bears just fine, but I wanted to remind you that you are in the home of the
NHL.
defending Stanley Cup champions.
All right.
There we go.
There are not a lot of Rubios in the NHL, as you can.
So anyway,
They don't play hockey in Cuba, so. Thank you.
just a little gift.
Well, who should I give this? Should I wear
You
it
can just
now?
send-
Or? Depends on how tough the interview is going to be.
Well, welcome to Chicago, and thank you for being here, and thanks again to 1871 for hosting this event. So, Senator, let's start by talking about the economy more broadly. Stock market's at highs. Unemployment's ticked down to 5.3%. And yet, so what's the problem? Why do so many people
It's
feel?
interesting. That's a great question, because what's interesting about this new economy is a lot of the traditional markers of economic health don't mean what they once did. So, for example, the unemployment rate, at a traditional 20th century view of things, we're at near employment. The problem is a lot of the people that are employed are underemployed. In essence, they are earning wages that have not kept up with the cost of living. A graphic example of that is that in 31 states in this country, childcare is more expensive than going to college. So imagine if you're a single mother that makes $900 a week, you're employed. But if $300 a week or $250 a week is going to childcare, that's a huge chunk of your budget that's gone, and you can't work without it. So that's an example of then you've got millions of people that have dropped out of the searching for work. In essence, they've given up. They've become demoralized. They're working part-time, different jobs here versus there. So, and then, of course, the nature of the economy is such that there's a lot of people that will not work at one company for 25 years. You're doing jobs as opposed to working at a firm, so you're jumping in and out of the labor pool depending on these factors. And the result of all this is that the unemployment rate no longer means what it once did, especially when you take into account that the labor participation, the number of people participating in the labor force, is at as low as it's been, I think, in over 30 years. And then you add to that wages. Basically, wages have been stagnant for 2 decades, while the cost of living has rapidly increased. And the only way you're ever going to close that gap is through the things I've discussed, the innovation necessary to create better paying jobs, and then helping people acquire the skills they need for those better paying jobs.
It's led people to talk of income inequality, right? That the top 1% is getting richer while the sort of Main Street's being left behind. What's the biggest of the things that you outlined? What's the single most important thing? The single thing you would do upon taking office that would help sort of correct that?
Well, the first thing is income inequality is a symptom of a broader problem, which is opportunity inequality. So income inequality exists for a couple reasons, but the primary one is at the higher paying jobs of the 21st century, the careers that are really economically fulfilling in the 21st century just pay a lot more money than similar careers did in the 20th. But if you're not in one of those fields or in one of those industries, then you're stagnant. And so the result is that gap. There really isn't one thing you can do. There's 2 things you have to do. The first is you have to make America the best place in the world to create jobs that pay more. And then you have to give our people the skills they need for those jobs that pay more. I always tell my parents' story because they had lived here during a time, and I grew up during a time, where a bartender and a maid could make enough money to afford home ownership, raise a family, and retire with dignity. Jobs like that simply don't pay enough anymore because those things cost more and those jobs haven't kept pace. In order for my parents to be able to do today what they did 25 years ago, my dad would have had to become an electrician. My mother would have had to become a dental hygienist or a paralegal. But that requires higher education, which many people have no access to because they have to work full-time and raise a family. They cannot drop everything and sit in a classroom for 2 years. So that's why we have to do 2 things. Make us the best place in the world to create those better paying jobs, and then make it the easiest place in the world to acquire the skills you need for those new, better paying jobs. And you have to do both.
Greece is in the news. Puerto Rico is in the news. How much of an economic drag is the $18 trillion national debt, and what do you propose to do
Well,
about
it's significant for 2 reasons. One, obviously, the more debt is being sold, the more capital is being dedicated to debt, and the less is available to investment in the private sector. But beyond it, it creates the specter of a debt crisis. And a debt crisis is not a good thing for a country that's trying to grow. It doesn't inspire confidence in the future. And if nothing changes, if we continue doing things the way we are now, at some point we will have a debt crisis. We have been insulated up to now because we're the global reserve currency, because so many other places are unstable. But eventually, investors, people that loan money to America by buying our debt, are going to insist on a higher yield. In essence, higher interest rates higher returns on their loaning of money to us. When that happens, the interest payments alone would trigger the debt crisis. And the results would be catastrophic for the most important economy in the world. The only way to fix the national debt is through a combination of dynamic economic growth, through the things I've just outlined here today, and by reforming Social Security and Medicare. And I want to reform those programs without making any changes for people like my mother. My mother's on Social Security, my mother's on Medicare. I want those programs to stay exactly the way they are for her and people of a similar age, people that are already retired or about to retire. That will require my generation and people younger than me to accept that our Social Security and Medicare is going to be different than our parents'. It'll still be the best thing in the world, but it's going to work differently. We're going to have to retire a year later than our parents did. Our benefits may not grow as fast if we stay with traditional Social Security as our parents did. Our Medicare plan may involve choices in the private market. My point is that that's the only way that we're going to be able to bring spending under control to balance our budget long term. Our national debt is not being driven by foreign aid, which is less than 1% of our budget. It's not being driven by defense spending. It's not being driven by food stamps and welfare. All these programs that I just mentioned are in need of reform. But the driver of our debt are these very important programs that spend more money than they take in and will continue to do so at an increasing rate for the foreseeable future.
You mentioned regulation, and you just mentioned Medicare. The Affordable Care Act, just upheld by the Supreme Court as constitutional. Republicans, I think most Republicans in the field say repeal and replace. Is that where you are? If you're elected?
Let me tell you why. Number one, we do have a health insurance problem in America that needs to be confronted. This was the wrong approach. What it's largely done is put millions of Americans, including many that were previously insured, into a government-mandated plan. So these plans, in order to be affordable, have had to do two things. They've had to make co-payments very high and deductibles very high. So what you now have are individuals insured under one of these exchange plans that are going into an emergency room or a doctor, and then they're getting a bill. And the bill could be as high as $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, depending on what your deductible and your co-payment was. And they just simply don't have that kind of money. So as a result, the provider is also not getting paid. So suddenly you have insurance plans that not only are expensive in terms of the bills you're taking on, but doesn't have the number of providers and gives you the choices that you need. Why? Because a doctor knows that if they can't collect the co-payment and they can't collect the deductible, they're not going to get paid the full amount of their charge. So suddenly more providers don't want to participate in these plans. So now you have an insurance, yes, the premium is subsidized, but you have a high deductible, a high co-payment, and a limited number of doctors and hospitals, and especially specialists to choose from. I think a better approach would be to say, in the 21st century, every American will be in charge of their own health insurance decisions. Every American, whether it's a tax credit if you don't make enough money, your own money if you do, or your employer's money, will be given the opportunity to purchase health insurance from any company in any state in America. And you will be given a chance to purchase the kind of insurance you want. For some people, that may be a health savings account for out-of-pocket expenses and a catastrophic hospitalization. For others, it may require more comprehensive care. My point is, if you now empower the consumer, the private sector will now begin to create plans and compete for your business on the basis of price and quality. The way you see in auto insurance, I know it's not a perfect analogy, but you can't turn on the TV without getting 5 or 6 commercials for Liberty Mutual and Prudential. Which one is Flo? Prudential, right? Progressive. And Progressive and State Farm. Why? Because your employer and the government doesn't tell you what your auto insurance is. You choose it. Companies know you're in charge of the spending. They will target and market to you on the basis of quality and pricing. I think that's a better approach than what we have now.
You mentioned immigration reform as part of the innovation piece of your plan, and I thought I heard you say that part of that was to protect American workers. Did I hear that right, and does that mean that you think that immigration puts downward pressure on wages?
No, I think what protects American workers is if you go towards a merit-based system of education, you are now bringing people into this country on the basis of what they can contribute economically. And some people often think of that a high-skill worker, someone, and it doesn't have to be in the tech industry. But the evidence shows that when you're able to attract the world's best talent, that actually creates jobs for Americans because it makes companies more productive. It allows them to open new lines of business and to expand existing lines of business. And that creates jobs for people already living here. That's why I think a merit-based system of education, of immigration, is what we need in the 21st century in this country. We are engaged in a global competition, not just for investment, not just for innovation. We are engaged in a global competition for talent. We need to have a higher education system that allows us to attract the best in the world, as opposed to an immigration system that today is largely built on whether or not you have a relative living here.
I want to ask you about cybersecurity. It's one of the biggest. I mean, we read about the Office of Personnel Management hack, something like 12, 14 million files stolen. We're seeing this more and more. A lot of people saying it is the biggest threat. What's your take on that, and what would you do about it as president?
Well, 2 points. One is, I think it's important for government to become infused in the best practices and the cutting edge. Today it is not. You have multiple agencies, each with their own chief information officer. Sadly, sometimes 3 generations out of step with the latest practices in an industry. And so I think it is important for government to become infused with the best practices and to have some unitary standard that all agencies have to comply with, because ultimately if you can hack into the data files of one agency, it gives you a backdoor access to multiple other agencies as well. The second, I think it's important we pass a cybersecurity bill that gives the private sector the confidence to collaborate and share information with government without being exposed to lawsuits or government interference and things of this nature. Because this is an ongoing threat. It is evolving as quickly as the solutions are. You come up with a solution for a cyber breach and already 5 new potential threats have been created that you have to confront. You need to have more collaboration, especially because of there is no such thing as the government technology sector and the private technology sector. They're all interwoven. And even a government breach could ultimately lead to a private sector breach and vice versa. So I think it's important to pass cybersecurity legislation that allows there to be more safe harbor collaboration between the private sector and the government.
As you look at the global landscape, who's our biggest economic challenge or threat to overtaking America?
Well, I don't know about overtaking America. Our biggest threat is America. We are the biggest threat to ourselves if we refuse to embrace these opportunities. The great news about the 21st century is it's not a zero-sum game. In essence, for us to prosper does not mean someone else has to be worse off. It doesn't have to be that way, especially in a globalized economy where prosperity here could also lead to prosperity somewhere else, and vice versa. We need to stop thinking about it in terms of we win, you lose, whether it's in our own domestic economy or the world at large. That's one of the most promising things about the 21st century. Technology has flattened information. Today, something that's innovated in this building could be shared within seconds with someone halfway around the world. Knowledge has become a shared commodity as opposed to something controlled by a handful of people for their benefit at the expense of everyone else. That being said, there are other nations that would like to replace us on the global stage as the predominant power. I clearly believe China has that ambition. Their leadership does anyway. That doesn't mean their people necessarily share that view in terms of seeing it as an adversarial relationship. And I do think that in many respects, how America and China interact with one another will be the single biggest geopolitical story of the 21st century. It will determine much of what else happens in the world. I think Russia has significant domestic problems. Their GDP is only $2 trillion. It is not an economic power, but it is a military power run by a man who is determined on being a great leader of a great country, and he can only do that militarily. So I think they pose some geopolitical challenges as well. And then there's the challenges of transnational criminal groups and non-state actors like ISIS, et cetera. But in terms of overtaking us economically, I don't view it that way. I view it as this. If we do what we need to do to fulfill our potential, the 21st century will create plenty of prosperity, not just for America, but for hundreds of millions of people around the world. Because ultimately, we want there to be hundreds of millions of people on this planet who can afford to buy the services we offer and the products we manufacture.
I'm trying to get a time cue because I know you got to get out of here. Do we know how much time we have left? 5 minutes left? Okay. I also noticed that you mentioned in your speech that we can't continue to grow government like we did in the 2000s. George W. Bush was president for 8 of those years.
Well, the Congress had a big role to play in that as well. I mean, ultimately, what you have found is even people in my own party run for office on the promise of limiting the size of government, but then they grow it themselves. And if you look back at that period of time, we had tax reductions in America, and yet we had historic growth in revenue for government that were overshadowed by historic increases in spending. And so it's important. Look, government has an important role to play, and it needs to play its role. But we have to understand you can't have more government than what you can afford. And you're learning that. They're learning that the hard way in Greece. They're learning that the hard way in a territory of the United States and Puerto Rico. They're learning that the hard way in Detroit and in other places around this country. And inevitably, we will learn that the hard way as a nation as well.
You also mentioned that the system is rigged, but it's big government that's doing the rigging. It's interesting. There's a populist strain among the left and the right. You see this with what's going on with Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, the sort of Occupy Wall Street folks. But on the right, the Tea Party. Look at their beef is with crony capitalism, right? Big government colluding with big business to rig the game, sort of against Main Street, the sort of, the average guy. Is crony capitalism, how big of a problem is it, and what would you do about that as president?
Well,
is there anything that can be
Yeah,
done?
I mean, first of all, it goes back to the point that the more government controls the economy, the more people who can influence government win at the expense of everybody else. So I tell a story in my book, American Dreams. I teach a course at Florida International University. My students were complaining that they had just traveled somewhere and had used this new system, this new program at the time called Uber. Nobody had heard of before. And they were upset that they couldn't get it when their app didn't work when they got to Miami. And they didn't understand why. And so I pounced. I said, well, here's why. The reason why you can't use Uber in Miami is because an established industry, the medallion holders for taxi cabs, raise a lot of money and have influence over county government. And they have convinced county government not to allow anyone else to offer the service that they offer. And as a result, they've created for themselves a monopoly, using the power of government to crowd out an innovative competitor in that space. And I made that connection because I think that happens quite often in American government and in American politics. You have established industries who create rules and regulations that only they can comply with, knowing that it will crowd out an innovative competitor that will try to enter that space. And the result is for everyone to see. After Dodd-Frank, big banks have consolidated to the point where they're bigger than ever. Meanwhile, 40% of small and community banks have evaporated. They've either been bought out or they've closed. Imagine if Blockbuster Video, when it was around, and some of the people in this room don't even know what that is, but imagine if they had been able to convince the federal government to pass a law that said this: in order to rent a movie, you must rent it in person at a retail facility where you show your ID. And their argument would have been at the time, look, we want to prevent kids from seeing rated R movies, and the only way to ensure that is by making sure they come to the store, show us the ID when they rent the movie. That would have been the argument they could have made. Had they done that, we never would have had Netflix or any of the other downloading services that are now available. I know that sounds far-fetched. I know there are some former Blockbuster shareholders kicking themselves for not thinking of it. But that's the sort of thing that you see quite often, where established industries will use their connection to government to create regulations or parameters that only they can comply with, meaning they limit the amount of competition they confront.
Last question. You're headed from here straight to Iowa to do some retail politicking. What are you hearing most from voters on the trail with regard to the economy or anything else? What are their concerns?
I would describe the state of the country as uncertainty, insecurity about today, and uncertainty about the future. And there's two reasons why this is happening. On the geopolitical level, every single day brings news of something happening in the world that makes it seem more dangerous than ever. ISIS beheads another 20 people. A terrorist attack somewhere. Russia's invading a country. China's building islands in the South China Sea. And then at home, they know something has changed. Right? All the things that we once told people they needed to do to succeed don't work as well as they once did. But no one has yet explained what the new way of doing things is. In essence, no one has explained to people why the old ways no longer work and what the new ways should be. And I think that is what's embedded in all the questions that we get. And so you run into young people that did everything they were told. Go to college, get a degree. They even borrowed money to pay for it. Now they are working somewhere they could have worked without the $50,000 of student loans. They have no idea when they're ever going to find a career, buy a home, start a family, or do anything else for that matter. You have people that are working at the same job they had 10 years ago. But 10 years ago at that job, they saved money. Now they live paycheck to paycheck. And if their refrigerator breaks down, they're in a lot of trouble. That's the sort of anxiety that people are confronting. And our leadership has not taken the time to explain why it's happening and what the new ways of doing things should be instead.
I said that was the last question. I lied. I think we can have one more question.
Okay.
And I'm out, so I'm just going to wing it. Tell me about you're running in, this race is remarkable. I mean, it is historic, wide open, 14, 15, 16 candidates on the Republican side, and a big debate coming up soon. What's it like to be in this moment, in this race that's historic?
Well, I have nothing to compare it to, having not run before, but for president. But I think part of it is a symptom of a new economy and a new age. Today, and it used to be not long ago that to run for president, you had to have this big organization, access to millions of dollars up front, just to get your message out. Now there are so many ways to communicate with voters, some of which cost very little money, that many people could launch a campaign in the hopes of catching fire. So that's a factor. But I think the other thing that I would say about it is, to me, it's really an incredible opportunity to have a vibrant debate before the country about our future, about the fact that what we are facing today is not a cyclical downturn. This is not just the normal ups and downs of economic life. This is a massive, ongoing, rapid restructuring of every aspect of our lives, geopolitical and economic. And we either adjust to it, embrace it, and we will have a great century, or we will be left behind by the future. And that's what I'm excited about, being able to use this campaign as a platform to have that conversation, and ultimately in the hopes of serving as president and guiding us into that new American century.
Senator Rubio,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.